Hi, Year 5. So we're going to read another chapter of Anglo-Saxon Boy. Chapter 4, Dark Blood. They left at dawn the next day, the Earl there to bid them farewell as they rode out through the gate. Magnus led the column with Hakon by his side, 25 housecarls following. Behind them, a dozen spare mounts carrying their weapons and armour and supplies. The track from the farm led over the hills, and by the time the sun was up properly, they were well on their way, travelling northwards. Magnus set the pace, a steady trot, and continued to brood on what his mother had said. He felt proud that his father had given him such a task and a half-troop of his own housecarls to lead. Magnus was determined to make a good job of it. But now he was confused. What had his mother meant? How could the Godwins be their own worst enemies? The family was doing fine, and Magnus was sure his father would sort out Uncle Tossig's problems. Eventually, Magnus decided it had just been his mother's fears for him that had made her talk like that, and he put it out of his mind. The journey was uneventful, at least to begin with. The lands they rode through were peaceful and prosperous. The people they encountered, weary of armed men, were not terrified. On the first day, they stopped at dusk to make camp beside a narrow stream. Magnus wondered if he should give orders, but he remembered from the war trail that warriors like these didn't need them. They fed and watered the horses, lit a fire and made a meal, sorted out who would stand watch and when. How long will it take to get to York, Hakon? He said at last. They were sitting together by the fire, the rest of the men spread out in a circle around it, sparks floating in the coils of smoke that rose above them. A fox barked somewhere in the night. If we ride hard, maybe 15 days, longer if we don't. We'll be riding hard then. The sooner we arrive, the better. Hakon turned to him and raised an eyebrow. Magnus could see the red and yellow flames of the fire dancing in the housecarl's eyes. So this will be more than just a family visit, will it? Hakon said quietly. Is there anything you want to tell me, Magnus? It'd be good to know what kind of trouble we'll be getting into. Why do you say that? It sounds as if you're expecting it. I always expect trouble, and I know that your uncle has enemies in the north. I'm guessing the Earl is sending you to find out how bad things really are. Is it so obvious? Magnus felt his cheeks burning. He thought about what he'd said that day, trying to recall if he had revealed anything. What have you heard? He said. My father didn't mention any enemies. Did he not? Hakon stared at him for a long moment. Then he shrugged and turned away to stare into the flames again. Well, I am only one of the Earl's sworn men, and I have no right to speak of such matters. Magnus tried for a while to get Hakon to say more, but the housecarl's face was closed, and he refused to be drawn on the subject. Hakon only spoke when he wanted to, as Magnus well knew. It was frustrating. Everybody seemed to know something about what was happening with Uncle Tossig, but nobody was willing to speak of it. The more Magnus brooded, the more he wished he knew himself what kind of trouble they were riding towards. 4 days later, they splashed across the stream over the Thames and entered Mercia. The country was much the same as south of the river, and so were the people and their farms, although as Magnus and his men travelled north, he noticed settlements were fewer and further between. By the 10th day, ploughed fields began to give way to wild moors and hills, and another 5 days brought them to Northumbria, where they followed the Roman road that would take them the last few miles to York. It was covered in dirt, but the old paving stones were beneath the soil, and the road was wide and straight as an arrow. They kept moving northwards, the sun shining on a cloudless afternoon. After a while, Magnus saw a dark smudge of smoke rising into the sky from somewhere ahead. Hakon had seen it too, and reined in his horse. He peered into the distance, shielding his eyes from the sun with his hand. What is it, Hakon? Said Magnus, stopping beside him. A forest fire? No, I'd say that's a farm building. Farm burning, said Hakon. Might be raiders. Do you think so? What should we do? Said Magnus. The words tumbled out of his mouth before he could stop them. He felt his cheeks grow warm with shame in front of Hakon and the men. As their leader, he should know what to do. Make sure we're ready for whatever we find, Hakon said quietly. He glanced back at the spare mounts and let his eyes fall on a couple of the men behind. Magnus followed his gaze and understood what Hakon was telling him. Right, we'll get on before we go any further, Magnus said in a loud and bold voice. as said in as loud and bold a voice as he could. Then I want you two men to scout ahead, find out what's happening. An excellent plan, my lord, said Hakon, his face serious, his eyes smiling. They halted, unpacked their weapons and armour from the spare mount, and quickly prepared themselves. Magnus put on his mail shirt and helmet, checked his sword, tucked his axe in his belt. The scouts galloped off, one of them more to the left of the road, the other taking a track through the trees on the right. Hakon said to give them a good start, but eventually Magnus led the others, now a line of mail-clad warriors bristling with spear blades and shields, towards the smoke. A mile or so down the road they came to another track. It led up a hill straight towards the column of smoke, which now filled the sky before them. Magnus looked at Hakon, who nodded, and they took the track to the crest of the hill. Just before they got there, both scouts returned from beyond it, and stopped in front of them. Looks like a raid, said one, but whoever it was is long gone. Magnus spurred on his horse, rode up the crest and paused. Below him was a wide valley with a stream running through it between rich green pastures. Someone had built a farmhouse in the heart of the valley, and a barn and byres, and circled them with a palisade. But now they were burnt-out ruins, their blackened timbers like the ribs of giant skeletons, the cold air filled with the reek of charred wood. Well, it seems they made a fight of it anyway, Hakon said. Magnus rode down to the 5 bodies that were lying in the farmyard. A tree of ravens had settled on them to peck at their flesh, and now the birds flew off with indignant squawks. 2 of the men were grown men, the other boys of a similar age to Magnus and his brothers. Each one had a hunting spear or wood axe in his hand or lying nearby. All of them had the kind of wounds Magnus had seen on the war trail. Limbs hacked off, stomachs pierced by spear thrusts, heads split open by sword or axe. That dark blood lay in pools seeping into the mud beneath them. Magnus felt his stomach churn. His breakfast of porridge rose into his throat. The taste of bile strong in his mouth, and he leaned away from his horse to be sick. Who did this, Hakon? He said, wiping his mouth. And where are the women? Could have been some neighbours with a grudge, said Hakon, shrugging. Could just as well have been raiders, a war band passing through. Maybe your uncle will be able to tell you if they had any dead. If they had any dead or wounded, they must have taken them away when they left. I know what happened to the woman, Magnus. Hakon was right. Magnus knew very well what they would have. But Hakon was right. Magnus knew very well that they would find the bodies of the older women in the burnt farmhouse, and that any younger women and girls would have been taken to be sold as slaves. Magnus offered up a silent prayer for them, thinking of his mothers and sisters. There is nothing we can do here, he said at last. We ride on to York. The sun was sinking in a blaze of red over the hills when they arrived, and Magnus saw the city was ringed by the old Roman walls, although in many places they had been roughly repaired with stone. The wooden gates were shut, and a dozen warriors stared down from the battlements at the top of the tall gatehouse. One raised a war bow and fired an arrow that thumped into the ground in front of Hakon's mount. Now, that's no way to welcome important guests, is it, lads? Hakon called out. The Lord Magnus, son of Harold Godwinson, has ridden a long way to visit his uncle Tosig. You'd better open those gates for him and be quick about it. There was a flurry of movement at the top of the gatehouse, and Magnus could hear men yelling. Moments later, the gates slowly began to grind open. Magnus spurred his horse forward into the city of York, Hakon at his side. End of chapter 4.